evening, tribe. Welcome back to the Tome, the channel in which every week we flip through the pages of human knowledge and read about whoever or whatever we find. And today we are learning about the life and times of none other than American hero and icon George Washington. So, if learning about some of history's most memorable, important or iconic people in podcast format is your thing, then subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell and let me know what you think in the comments section below. The Washington family was a wealthy Virginian planter family that made its fortune through land speculation and the cultivation of tobacco. Washington's great-grandfather, John Washington, emigrated in 1656 from Soulgrave, Northamptonshire, England, to the English colony of Virginia, where he accumulated 5,000 acres of land, including Little Hunting Creek on the Potomac River. George Washington was born on February the 22nd, 1732, at Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia, and was the first of 6 children of Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. His father was a justice of the peace and a prominent public figure who had 4 additional children from his first marriage to Jane Butler. The family moved to Little Hunting Creek in 1735. 3 years later, in 1738, they moved to Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg, Virginia, on the Rappahannock River. When Augustine died in 1743, Washington inherited Ferry Farm and 10 slaves. His older half-brother Lawrence inherited Little Hunting Creek and renamed it Mount Vernon. Washington did not have the formal education his elder brothers received at Appleby Grammar School in England, but he did learn mathematics, trigonometry, and land surveying. He was a talented draftsman and map maker, and by early adulthood he was writing with, quote, considerable force, unquote. However, his writing displayed little wit or humour. In pursuit of admiration, status and power, he tended to attribute his shortcomings and failures to someone else's ineffectuality. Washington often visited Mount Vernon and Belvoir, the plantation that belonged to Lawrence's father-in-law, William Fairfax. Fairfax became Washington's patron and surrogate father, and Washington spent a month in 1748 with a team surveying Fairfax's Shenandoah Valley property. He received a surveyor's license the following year from the College of William and Mary. Even though Washington had not served the customary apprenticeship, Fairfax appointed him surveyor of Culpeper County, Virginia, and he appeared in Culpeper County to take his oath of office on July 20th, 1749. He subsequently familiarised himself with the frontier region, and though he resigned from the job in 1750, he continued to do surveys west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. By 1752, he had bought almost 1,500 acres in the valley and owned 2,315 acres. In 1751, Washington made his only trip abroad when he accompanied Lawrence to Barbados, hoping the climate would cure his brother's tuberculosis. Washington contracted smallpox during that trip, which immunized him, but left his face slightly scarred. Lawrence died in 1752, and Washington leased Mount Vernon from his widow. Lawrence Washington's service as Lieutenant General of the Virginia Militia inspired his half-brother George to seek a commission. Virginia's Lieutenant Governor, Robert Dinwiddie, appointed George Washington as a major and commander of one of 4 militia districts. The British and French were competing for control of the Ohio Valley. Whilst the British were constructing forts along the Ohio River, the French were doing just the same, constructing forts between the Ohio River and Lake Erie. In October 1753, Dinwiddie appointed Washington as a special envoy. He had sent George to demand French forces to vacate land that was being claimed by the British. Washington was also appointed to make peace with the Iroquois Confederacy and to gather further intelligence about the French forces. Washington met with Half-King Tanacharian and other Iroquois chiefs at Logstown and gathered information about the numbers and locations of the French force, as well as intelligence concerning individuals taken prisoner by the French. Washington was given the nickname Conotacarus, Town Destroyer or Devourer of Villages, by the Tanacharian. The nickname had previously been given to his great-grandfather, John Washington, in the late 17th century. Washington's party reached the Ohio River in November 1753 and were intercepted by a French patrol. The party was escorted to Fort Le Boeuf, where Washington was received in a friendly manner. He delivered the British demand to vacate for the French commander St. Pierre, but the French refused to leave. St. Pierre gave Washington his official answer in a sealed envelope after a few days' delay, as well as food and extra winter clothing for his party journey back to Virginia. Washington completed the precarious mission in 77 days, in difficult winter conditions, achieving a measure of distinction when his report was published in Virginia and in London. In February 1754, Dinwiddie promoted Washington to lieutenant colonel and second in command of the 300-strong Virginian regiment, with orders to confront French forces at the Forks of Ohio. Washington set out for the Forks with half the regiment in April, but soon learned a French force of 1,000 had begun construction of Fort Duquesne right there. In May, having set up a defensive position at Great Meadows, he learned that the French had made camp 7 miles away. He decided to take the offensive. The French detachment proved to be only about 50 men, so Washington advanced on May 28th with a small force of Virginians and Indian allies to ambush them. What took place, known as the Battle of Jumonville Glen or the Jumonville Affair, was disputed, but French forces were killed outright with muskets and hatchets. French commander Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, who carried a diplomatic message to the British to evacuate, was killed. French forces found Jumonville and some of his men dead and scalped and assumed Washington was responsible. Washington blamed his translator for not communicating the French intentions. Dinwiddie congratulated Washington for his victory over the French. This incident ignited the French and Indian War, which later became part of the larger 7 Years' War. In 1755, Washington served voluntarily as an aide to General Edward Braddock, who led a British expedition to expel the French from Fort Duquesne and the Ohio country. On Washington's recommendation, Braddock split the army into one main column and a lightly equipped flying column. Suffering from a severe case of dysentery, Washington was left behind, and when he rejoined Braddock later, the French and their Indian allies had ambushed the divided army. 2/3 of the British force became casualties, including the mortally wounded Braddock. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage, Washington, still very ill, rallied the survivors and formed a rearguard, allowing the remnants of the force to disengage and retreat. During the engagement, he had 2 horses shot out from underneath him, and his hat and coat were bullet-pierced. His conduct under fire redeemed his reputation among critics of his command in the Battle of Fort Necessity. But he was not included by the succeeding commander, Colonel Thomas Dunbar, in planning subsequent operations. On January the 6th, 1759, Washington, at the age of 26, married Martha Danbridge Custis, the 27-year-old widow of a wealthy plantation owner, Daniel Parke Custis. The marriage took place at Martha's estate. She was intelligent, gracious, and experienced in managing a planter's estate, and the couple created a happy marriage. They raised John Parke Custis and Martha Parke Custis, children from her previous marriage, and later Jackie's children, Eleanor Parke Custis and George Washington Parke Custis. Washington's 1751 bout with smallpox is thought to have rendered him sterile, though it is equally likely that Martha may have sustained injury during the birth of Patsy, her final child, making additional births impossible. The couple lamented not having any children together. They moved to Mount Vernon near Alexandria, where he took up life as a planter of tobacco and wheat and emerged as a political figure. The marriage gave Washington control over Martha's 1/3 dower interest in the 18,000-acre Custis estate, and he managed the remaining 2/3 for Martha's children. The estate also included 84 slaves. He became one of Virginia's wealthiest men, which increased his social standing. Washington believed the Stamp Act of 1765 was an act of oppression, and he celebrated its repeal the following year. In March 1766, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, asserting that parliamentary law superseded colonial law. In the late 1760s, the interference of the British Crown in American lucrative Western land speculation spurred on the American Revolution. Washington himself was a prosperous land speculator, and in 1767 he encouraged, quote, adventures, unquote, to acquire backcountry Western lands. Washington helped lead widespread protests against the Townshend Acts passed by Parliament in 1767, and he introduced a proposal in May 1769 drafted by George Mason, which called Virginians to boycott British goods. The acts were mostly repealed in 1770. Parliament sought to punish Massachusetts colonists for their role in the Boston Tea Party in 1774 by passing the Coercive Acts, which Washington referred to as, quote, an invasion of our rights and privileges, end quote. He said Americans must not submit to acts of tyranny since, quote, custom and use shall make us a tame and abject slaves, as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway, end quote. That July, he and George Mason drafted a list of resolutions to the Fairfax County Committee, which Washington chaired, and the committee adopted the Fairfax Resolves, calling for a Continental Congress. On August the 1st, Washington attended the First Virginian Convention, where he was selected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress. As tensions rose in 1774, he helped train county militias in Virginia and organised enforcement of the Continental Association boycott of British goods instituted by the new Congress. The American Revolutionary War began on April 19, 1775, with the battles of Lexington and Concord and the siege of Boston. The colonists were divided over breaking away from British rule and split into two factions: patriots, who rejected British values, and loyalists, who desired to remain subject to the king. General Thomas Gage was commander of British forces in the Americas, and at the beginning of the war, upon hearing the shocking news of the onset, Washington was, quote, sobered and dismayed, end quote. He hastily departed Mount Vernon on May 4, 1775, to join the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Congress created the Continental Army on June the 14th of that year, and Samuel and John Adams nominated Washington to become its commander-in-chief. Washington was chosen over John Hancock because of his military experience and the belief that a Virginian would be better to unite the colonies. He was considered an incisive leader who kept his ambition in check. He was unanimously elected Commander-in-Chief by Congress the very next day. Washington appeared before Congress in uniform and gave an acceptance speech on June the 16th, declining a salary, though he was later reimbursed expenses. He was commissioned on June 19th of that year and was roundly praised by congressional delegates, including John Adams, who proclaimed that he was the man best suited to lead and unite the colonies. Congress appointed Washington General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United Colonies and of all the forces raised or to be raised by them, and instructed him to take charge of the siege of Boston on June 22nd, 1775. Early in 1775, in response to the growing rebellious movement, London sent British troops commanded by General Thomas Gage to occupy Boston. They set up fortifications about the city, making it impervious to attack. Various local militias surrounded the city and effectively trapped the British, resulting in a standoff. As Washington headed for Boston, word of his march preceded him, and he was greeted everywhere. Gradually, he became a symbol of the Patriot cause. Upon arrival on July 2nd, 1775, 2 weeks after the Patriot defeat at nearby Bunker Hill, he set up his Cambridge, Massachusetts headquarters and inspected the new army there, only to find an undisciplined and badly outfitted militia. After consultation, he initiated Benjamin Franklin's suggested reforms, drilling the soldiers and imposing strict discipline, floggings, and incarceration. Washington ordered his officers to identify the skills of recruits to ensure military effectiveness whilst removing incompetent officers. He petitioned Gage, his former superior, to release captured Patriot officers from prison and treat them humanely. In October, King George III declared that the colonies were in open rebellion and relieved General Gage of command for his incompetence. In June 1775, Congress ordered an invasion of Canada. It was led by Benedict Arnold, who, despite Washington's strong objection, drew volunteers from the latter's force during the siege of Boston. The move on Quebec failed, with the American forces being reduced to less than half and forced to retreat. The Continental Army, further diminished by expiring short-term enlistments and by January 1776 reduced by half to 9,600 men, had to be supplemented with the militia, and was joined by Knox with heavy artillery. When the Charles River froze, Washington was eager to cross and storm Boston, but General Gates and others were opposed to untrained militia striking well-garrisoned fortifications. Washington reluctantly agreed to secure the Dorchester Heights, 100 feet above Boston, in an attempt to force the British out of the city. On March 9th, under the cover of darkness, Washington's troops brought up Knox's big guns and bombarded British ships in Boston Harbour. On March 17th, 9,000 British troops and loyalists began a chaotic 10-day evacuation of Boston aboard 120 ships. Soon after, Washington entered the city with 500 men, with explicit orders not to plunder the city. He ordered vaccinations against smallpox to great effect, as he did later in Morristown, New Jersey. He refrained from exerting military authority in Boston, leaving civilian matters in the hands of local authorities. Washington then proceeded to New York City, arriving on April 13th, and began constructing fortifications to thwart the expected British attack. He ordered his occupying forces to treat civilians and their property with respect, to avoid the abuses which Bostonian citizens suffered at the hands of the British troops during their occupation. A plot to assassinate or capture him was discovered but thwarted, resulting in the arrest of 98 people involved or complicit with, including the loyalist mayor of New York, David Matthews. Washington's bodyguard, Thomas Hickey, was hanged for mutiny and sedition. General Howe transported his resupplied army with the British fleet from Halifax to New York, knowing that the city was key to securing the continent. George Germain, who ran the British war effort in England, believed it could be won with one decisive blow. The British forces, including more than 100 ships and thousands of troops, began arriving on Staten Island on July the 2nd to lay siege to the city. After the Declaration of Independence was adopted on July the 4th, Washington informed his troops in his General Orders of July the 9th that Congress had declared the United Colonies to be, quote, free and independent states, end quote. Howe's troops' strength totaled 32,000 regulars and Hessian auxiliaries, and Washington's consisted of 23,000, mostly raw recruits and militia. In August, Howe landed 20,000 troops at Gravesend in Brooklyn and approached Washington's fortifications, as George III proclaimed the rebellious American colonialists to be traitors. Washington, opposing his generals, chose to fight based upon inaccurate information, and Howe's army had only 8,000 plus troops. In the Battle of Long Island, Howe assaulted Washington's flank and inflicted 1,500 Patriot casualties. The British suffered 400. Washington retreated, instructing General William Heath to acquire rivercraft in the area. On August 30th, General William Alexander held off the British and gave cover while the army crossed the East River under darkness to Manhattan Island without loss of life or material, although Alexander himself was captured. Howe, emboldened by his Long Island victory, dispatched Washington as, quote, George Washington Esquire, end quote, in futility to negotiate peace. Washington declined, demanding to be addressed with diplomatic protocol as general and fellow belligerent, not as a rebel, lest his men are hanged as such if captured. The siege of Yorktown was a decisive Allied victory by the combined forces of the Continental Army, commanded by General Washington, the French Army, commanded by General Comte de Rochambeau, and the French Navy, commanded by Admiral de Grasse. In the defeat of Cornwallis's British forces on August 19th, the march to Yorktown, led by Washington and Roch de Cambrai, began, which is known now as the, quote, celebrated march. Washington was in command of an army of 7,800 Frenchmen, 3,100 militia, and 8,000 Continentals. Not well experienced in siege warfare, Washington often referred to the judgment of General Rochambeau and used his advice about how to proceed. However, Rochambeau never challenged Washington's authority as the battle's commanding officer. By late September, Patriot French forces surrounded Yorktown, trapping the British army and preventing British reinforcements from Clinton in the north, whilst the French Navy emerged victorious at the Battle of Chesapeake. The final American offensive was begun with shot fired by Washington himself. The siege ended with a British surrender on October 19th, 1781. Over 7,000 British soldiers were made prisoners of war. In the last major land battle of the American Revolutionary War, Washington negotiated the terms of surrender for 2 days, and the official signing ceremony took place on October 19th. Cornwallis claimed illness and was absent, sending General Charles O'Hara as his proxy. As a gesture of goodwill, Washington held a dinner for the American, French, and British generals, all of whom fraternized on friendly terms and identified with one another as members of the same professional military caste. After the surrender at Yorktown, a situation developed that threatened relations between the newly independent America and Britain. Following a series of retributive executions between patriots and loyalists, Washington, on May 18, 1782, wrote in a letter to General Moses Hazen that a British captain would be executed in retaliation for the execution of Joshua Hoodie, a popular patriot leader who was hanged at the direction of the loyalist Richard Lippincott. Washington wanted Lippincott himself to be executed, but was rebuffed. Subsequently, Charles Askill was chosen instead by a drawing of lots from a hat. This was a violation of the 14th article of the Yorktown Articles of Capitulation, which protected prisoners of war from acts of retaliation. Later, Washington's feelings on the matters changed, and in a letter of November 13, 1782 to Askill, he acknowledged Askill's letter and situation, expressing his desire not to see any harm come to him. After much consideration between the Continental Congress, Alexander Hamilton, Washington, and appeals from the French crown, Askill was finally released. where Washington issued Askill a pass that allowed him passage to New York. As peace negotiations started, the British gradually evacuated troops from Savannah, Charlestown, and New York by 1783, and the French army and navy likewise departed. The American treasury was empty. Unpaid and mutinous soldiers forced the adjournment of Congress, and Washington dispelled unrest by suppressing the Newburgh Conspiracy. In March 1783, Congress promised officers a 5-year bonus. Washington submitted an account of $450,000 in expenses, which he had advanced to the army. The account was settled, though it was allegedly vague about large sums and included expenses his wife had incurred through visits to his headquarters. Washington resigned as Commander-in-Chief once the Treaty of Paris was signed, and he planned to retire to Mount Vernon. The treaty was ratified in April 1783, and Hamilton's Congressional Committee adapted the army for peacetime. Washington gave the Army's perspective to the committee in his Sentiments on a Peace Establishment. The treaty was signed on September 3rd, 1783, and Great Britain officially recognised the independence of the United States. Washington then disbanded his army, giving an eloquent farewell address to his soldiers on November 2nd. On November the 25th, the British evacuated New York City, and Washington and Governor George Clinton took possession. Washington advised Congress in August 1783 to keep a standing army, create a national militia of separate state units, and establish a navy and a national military academy. He circulated his farewell orders that discharged his troops, whom he called, quote, one patriotic band of brothers, end quote. Before his return to Mount Vernon, he oversaw the evacuation of all British forces in New York and was greeted by parades and celebrations, where he announced that Colonel Henry Knox had been promoted to the new Commander-in-Chief. After leading the Continental Army for 8.5 years, Washington bade farewell to his officers at Fraunces Tavern in December 1783 and resigned his commission several days later, refuting Loyalist predictions that he would not relinquish his military command. In a final appearance in uniform, he gave a statement to the Congress, quote, I consider it an indispensable duty to close this last solemn act of my official life by commending the interests of our dearest country to the protection of Almighty God and those who had the superintendence of them to his holy keeping. End quote. Washington's resignation was acclaimed at home and abroad and showed a skeptical world that the new republic would not degenerate into chaos. The same month, Washington was appointed President General of the Society of Cincinnati, a hereditary fraternity, and he served for the remainder of his natural life. Washington was longing to return home after spending just 10 days at Mount Vernon out of his 8.5 years of war. He arrived on Christmas Eve, delighted to be free of the bustle of the camp and the busy scenes of public life. Washington was longing to return home after spending just 10 days at Mount Vernon out of his 8.5 years of war. He arrived on Christmas Eve, delighted to be, quote, free of the bustle of camp and the busy scenes of public life, end quote. He was a celebrity and was feted during a visit to his mother at Fredericksburg in February 1784, and he received a constant stream of visitors wishing to pay their respects to him at Mount Vernon. Washington reactivated his interest in the Great Dismal Swamp and Potomac Canal projects begun during the war, though neither had paid him any dividends, and he undertook a 34-day, 680-mile trip to check on his land lodgings in the Ohio country. He oversaw the completion of his remodeling work at Mount Vernon, which transformed his residence into the mansion that survives to this very day, although his financial situation at the time was not strong. Creditors paid him in depreciated wartime currency, and he owed significant amounts in taxes and wages. Mount Vernon had made no profit during his absence, and he saw persistently poor crop yields due to pestilence and poor weather. His estate records its 11th year running at a deficit in 1787, and there was little prospect of improvement. Washington undertook a new landscaping plan and succeeded in cultivating a range of fast-growing trees and shrubs that were native to North America. He also began breeding mules after having been gifted a Spanish jack by King Charles III of Spain in 1784. There were few mules in the United States at that time, and he believed that properly bred mules would revolutionize agriculture and transportation. Washington was inaugurated president on the 30th of April 1789, taking the oath of office at Federal Hall in New York City. His coach was led by militia and a marching band, and followed by statesmen and foreign dignitaries in an inaugural parade with a crowd of 10,000. Chancellor Robert R. Livingston administered the oath, using a Bible provided by the Masons, after which the militia fired a 13-gun salute. Washington read a speech in the Senate chamber, asking, quote, "that almighty being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human deficit, consecrate the liberties and happiness of the peoples of the United States." End quote. Though he wished to serve without a salary, Congress insisted adamantly that he accept it, later providing Washington $25,000 per year to defray costs of the presidency. Washington wrote to James Madison, quote, "At the first of everything in our situation will serve to establish a precedent. It is devoutly wished on my part that these precedents be fixed on true principles." End quote. To that end, he preferred the title Mr. President over more majestic names proposed by the Senate, including His Excellency and His Highness the President. His executive precedents included the inaugural address, messages to Congress, and the cabinet form of the executive branch. Washington had planned to resign after his first term, but the political strife in the nation convinced him that he should remain in office for a second term. He was an able administrator and a judge of talent and character, and he regularly talked with department heads to get their advice. He tolerated opposing views, despite fears that a democratic system would lead to political violence, and he conducted a smooth transition of power to his successor. He remained non-partisan throughout his presidency and opposed the divisiveness of political parties, but he favoured a strong central government, was sympathetic to a federalist form of government, and leery of the Republican opposition. Washington dealt with major problems. The old Confederation lacked the powers to handle its workload and had very weak leadership, no executive, but a small bureaucracy of clerks, a large debt, worthless paper money, and no power to establish taxes. He had the task of assembling an executive department and relied on Tobias Lear for advice, selecting its officers. Great Britain refused to relinquish its forts in the American West, and Barbary pirates preyed on American merchant ships in the Mediterranean at a time when the United States did not even have a navy. Washington's first term was largely devoted to economic concerns, in which Hamilton had devised various plans to address the matters. The establishment of public credit became a primary challenge for the federal government. Hamilton submitted a report to a deadlocked Congress, and he, Madison, and Jefferson reached a compromise of 1790 in which Jefferson agreed to Hamilton's debt proposals in exchange for moving the nation's capital temporarily to Philadelphia. Washington's first term was largely devoted to economic concerns, in which Hamilton had devised various plans to address matters. The establishment of public credit became a primary challenge for the new and burgeoning federal government. Hamilton submitted a report to a deadlocked Congress, and he, Madison, and Jefferson reached the Compromise of 1790, in which Jefferson agreed to Hamilton's debt proposals in exchange for moving the nation's capital temporarily to Philadelphia and then near Georgetown on the Potomac River. The terms were legalized in the Funding Act of 1790 and the Residence Act, both of which Washington signed into law. Congress authorized the assumption and payment of the nation's debts, with funding provided by customs duties and excise taxes. In March 1791, at Hamilton's urging, with support from Madison, Congress imposed an excise tax on distilled spirits to help curtail the national debt, which took effect in July. Grain farmers strongly protested in Pennsylvania's frontier districts. They argued that they were unrepresented and were shouldering too much of the debt, comparing their situation to excessive British taxation before the Revolutionary War. On August the 2nd, Washington assembled his cabinet to discuss how to deal with the situation. Unlike Washington, who had reservations about using force, Hamilton had long waited for such a situation and was eager to suppress the rebellion by using federal authority and force. Not wanting to involve the federal government if possible, Washington called on Pennsylvania state officials to take the initiative, but they declined to take military action. On August the 7th, Washington issued his first proclamation for calling up state militias. After appealing for peace, he reminded the protesters that, unlike the rule of the British Crown, the federal law was issued by state-elected representatives. Threats and violence against tax collectors, however, escalated into defiance against the federal authority in 1794, and that gave rise to the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington issued a final proclamation on September the 25th, threatening to use the military force, but to no avail. The Federal Army was not up to task, so Washington invoked the Militia Act of 1792 to summon state militias. Governors sent troops, initially commanded by Washington, who gave the command to Light Horse Harry Lee to lead them into the rebellious districts. They took 150 prisoners, and the remaining rebels dispersed without further fighting. 2 of the prisoners were condemned to death, but Washington exercised his constitutional authority for the first time and pardoned them both. Washington's forceful actions demonstrated that the new government could protect itself and its tax collectors. This represented the first use of federal military forces against the state and its citizens, and remains the only time an incumbent president has commanded his troops in the field. Washington justified his actions against, quote, certain self-created societies, end quote, which he regarded as subversive organizations that threatened the national union. He did not dispute their right to protest, but he insisted that their dissent must not violate federal law. Congress agreed and extended their congratulations to him. Only Madison and Jefferson expressed indifference. In 1796, Washington declined to run for a third term of office, believing his death in office would create an image of a lifetime appointment. The precedent of a 2-term limit was created by his retirement from office. In May 1792, in anticipation of his retirement, Washington instructed James Madison to prepare a valedictory address, an initial draft of which was entitled the Farewell Address. In May 1792, in anticipation of his retirement, Washington instructed James Madison to prepare a valedictory address, an initial draft of what was entitled the Farewell Address. In May 1796, Washington sent the manuscript to his Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton, who did an extensive rewrite, whilst Washington provided final edits. On September 19, 1796, David Claypole's American Daily Advertiser published the final version of the address. Washington stressed that national identity was paramount, while a united America would safeguard freedom and prosperity. He warned the nation of 3 imminent dangers: regionalism, partisanship, and foreign entanglements, and said the, quote, name of American, which belongs to you, in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism, more than any appellation derived from local discriminations, end quote. Washington called for men to move beyond partisanship for the common good, stressing that the United States must concentrate on its own interests. He warned against foreign alliances and their influence in domestic affairs, and bitter partisanship and the dangers of political parties. He counselled friendship and commerce with all nations, but advised against involvement in European wars. He stressed the importance of religion, asserting that religion and morality are indispensable supports in a republic. Washington's address favoured Hamilton's Federalist ideology and economic policies. On December 12, 1799, Washington inspected his farms on horseback. He returned home late and had guests over for dinner. He had a sore throat the next day, but was well enough to mark trees for cutting. That evening he complained of chest congestion, but was still cheerful. On Saturday he awoke to an inflamed throat and difficulty breathing, so he ordered Estate Overseer George Warlins to remove nearly a pint of his blood. Bloodletting being a common practice of the time. His family summoned doctors James Carrick, Gustavus Richard Brown, and Elisha C. Dick. Dr. William Thornton arrived some hours after Washington died. Dr. Brown thought Washington had quinsy. Dr. Dick thought that the condition was a more serious, violent inflammation of the throat. They continued the process of bloodletting to approximately 5 pints, and Washington's condition deteriorated further. Dr. Dick proposed a tracheotomy, but the others were not familiar with the procedure and therefore disapproved. Washington instructed Brown and Dick to leave the room, while he assured Clarick, "Doctor, I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." That, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of the life and times of one George Washington, a most influential figure in not only American history but world history. I'm sure you will agree, and I love learning about George Washington myself. I love America. I love American history. I love American culture. So a lot of the videos I make are of people in America. So I hope you enjoyed that. The channel is getting a little bit of traction, which is great. We've also got a couple of trolls. In some of my earlier videos, video 1, video 2, I made a couple of mistakes, some editing mistakes. I got a photo wrong in the Sonny Barger video, and my trolls are not afraid to let me know about that. But I am working on it. I'm gaining in skill. I'm gaining in production quality as time goes on, so if you are one of the new subscribers, I do hope you'll stay with me as we go down this journey together, and let me know what you think in the comments section below. If you haven't subscribed yet, by all means, if you found this video informative, please do that. That would certainly help this channel out, and I thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.